The Library of Alexandria was founded in the early 3rd century BC in the Egyptian city of Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy I Soter. It was conceived as a center for collecting all known human knowledge. The implication is unprecedented intellectual ambition, while the limitation is uncertainty about its exact structure and scope. Ancient sources describe the library as part of a larger institution known as the Mauseon, dedicated to scholarly research. This implies systematic knowledge production. The limitation is that surviving descriptions are fragmentary and written centuries later. The library reportedly housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls from across the ancient world. This suggests a vast archive of texts. The limitation is that no catalog or inventory has survived to confirm exact numbers or contents. Scrolls were acquired through purchase, copying, and sometimes confiscation from visiting ships. This implies aggressive acquisition policies. The limitation is that such accounts rely on later writers whose accuracy cannot be independently verified. Works collected included philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and literature. This breadth implies interdisciplinary scholarship. The limitation is that most of these works are known only by later references. Scholars at Alexandria produced critical editions of texts, correcting errors through comparison. This implies early forms of textual criticism. The limitation is that original annotated manuscripts have not survived. The library attracted prominent scholars such as Euclid and Eratosthenes. Their association implies intellectual prestige. The limitation is that their direct use of the library is inferred rather than documented. Eratosthenes famously calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy while working in Alexandria. This suggests access to extensive resources. The limitation is that his methods survive only in secondary descriptions. The library functioned under royal patronage, tying knowledge production to political power. This implies state support. The limitation is vulnerability to political change. Ancient accounts describe the translation of foreign works into Greek, including scientific and religious texts. This implies cross-cultural exchange. The limitation is that few translations can be traced directly to Alexandria. The library existed in a city shaped by conquest and empire. This context implies instability beneath intellectual achievement. The limitation is that political tension threatened long-term continuity. No archaeological remains definitively identified as the Library of Alexandria have been found. This absence limits reconstruction. The implication is reliance on textual sources alone. Ancient writers disagree on the physical layout of the library. Some describe multiple buildings. The limitation is inconsistent testimony. The library's mission to collect all books implies selective judgment over knowledge. This raises questions about inclusion. The limitation is lack of evidence on excluded works. Scrolls were fragile, requiring constant maintenance. This implies labor-intensive preservation. The limitation is susceptibility to fire, humidity, and neglect. Alexandria was a hub of Mediterranean trade. This facilitated knowledge exchange. The limitation is exposure to conflict. Scholars lived and worked within the Mauseon, supported by stipends. This implies institutionalized research. The limitation is dependence on royal funding. The library became a symbol of intellectual authority in antiquity. This symbolic role implies influence beyond its walls. The limitation is that symbolism often exceeds reality. Ancient sources do not agree on when the library reached its peak. This creates chronological uncertainty. The limitation is fragmented historical memory. The distinction between the main library and subsidiary collections is unclear. This complicates understanding of loss. The limitation is structural ambiguity. Knowledge in Alexandria was recorded primarily on papyrus scrolls. This medium implies portability. The limitation is extreme vulnerability to destruction. Many works known today only by title were once reportedly housed there. This implies irreversible loss. The limitation is speculative reconstruction. The library operated for centuries, not as a single moment in time. This implies gradual evolution. The limitation is uneven documentation across periods. Some ancient critics question the accuracy of copied texts. This suggests quality control issues. The limitation is lack of surviving originals for comparison. The ambition to centralize knowledge was unprecedented. This implies a unique experiment. The limitation is absence of parallel institutions for comparison. The library's reputation grew after its decline, shaping modern perception. This implies retrospective idealization. The limitation is mythologization. Later generations described the library as irreplaceable. This frames its loss as catastrophic. The limitation is emotional distance from actual events. No contemporary account describes the library's daily operation in detail. This limits practical understanding. The implication is historical opacity. What survives about the library comes from scattered references across centuries. This implies reconstruction from fragments. The limitation is cumulative uncertainty. At this contextual stage, the Library of Alexandria stands as a documented institution of immense ambition, known primarily through absence. The implication is historical loss, while the limitation is clear. Without material remains, certainty is unattainable. One of the earliest accounts of the library's destruction links it to Julius Caesar's campaign in Alexandria in 48 BCE. Ancient writers report a fire spreading from the harbor. The implication is accidental damage, while the limitation is uncertainty about whether the main library or only nearby storage facilities were affected. Caesar himself did not mention the destruction of the library in his writings. This silence raises doubts about the scale of loss. The limitation is that omissions in historical records do not confirm absence of events. Later Roman authors disagree on the extent of damage caused by the fire. Some suggest thousands of scrolls were lost. The limitation is that these accounts were written decades or centuries later. Evidence suggests that Alexandria maintained additional collections beyond the main library. This implies redundancy. The limitation is confusion between multiple institutions when discussing destruction. The Serapeum of Alexandria housed a secondary library. This suggests knowledge survived initial damage. The limitation is lack of detailed inventories. The Serapeum was destroyed in the late 4th century CE during religious conflicts. This provides a documented event of loss. The limitation is uncertainty about how much material remained there at that time. Christian sources describe the destruction of pagan temples, including the Serapeum. This implies ideological conflict. The limitation is bias in surviving narratives. Some historians argue that the library declined gradually rather than being destroyed in a single event. This implies slow erosion of resources. The limitation is difficulty tracing gradual loss archaeologically. Political instability in Ramon, Egypt, affected funding for scholarly institutions. This implies administrative neglect. The limitation is limited documentation of budgets and patronage. Changes in language and scholarly focus reduced demand for older Greek texts. This suggests cultural shift. The limitation is indirect inference. Papyrus scrolls required constant copying to survive. Interruptions in this process imply decay. The limitation is absence of records tracking copying practices. The Muslim conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century is sometimes cited as the final destruction. This claim appears in much later sources. The limitation is lack of contemporary corroboration. Early Islamic historians do not mention the library's destruction. This silence challenges later narratives. The limitation is incomplete historical transmission. Many modern historians reject the idea of a single moment of destruction. This reflects critical reassessment. The limitation is reliance on negative evidence. The loss of the library represents cumulative disappearance rather than a single catastrophe. This reframes the mystery. The limitation is inability to quantify losses. No surviving text can be definitively traced to a scroll copied directly from the library. This limits verification. The implication is total material loss. References to lost works appear in later authors citing earlier texts. This suggests missing intermediaries. The limitation is uncertainty about original content. Scientific treatises known only by title imply gaps in knowledge transmission. This highlights consequence. The limitation is speculative reconstruction of impact. Some historians argue the library's influence is overstated. This challenges popular narratives. The limitation is measuring influence without surviving output. Others maintain that Alexandria shaped foundational scholarship. This implies long-term impact. The limitation is separating library influence from broader Hellenistic culture. The myth of a single burning appeals to narrative simplicity. This explains persistence. The limitation is oversimplification of historical processes. Archaeological excavation in Alexandria is constrained by modern urban development. This limits discovery. The implication is permanent obstruction. Without physical remains, reconstructions rely on literary analysis. This defines methodology. The limitation is interpretive subjectivity. The library's fate illustrates vulnerability of knowledge to political and cultural change. This is a broader implication. The limitation is generalization. No consensus exists on when the library effectively ceased functioning. This reflects ambiguity. The limitation is fragmented chronology. The absence of contemporaneous eyewitness accounts is critical. This restricts certainty. The limitation is reliance on later testimony. Historians must reconcile conflicting sources without material anchors. This complicates analysis. The limitation is evidentiary imbalance. The Library of Alexandria has become symbolic of lost knowledge itself. This shapes interpretation. The limitation is mythologization. Modern discussions often project modern values onto ancient institutions. This risks distortion. The limitation is anachronism. At this investigative stage, the library's disappearance appears gradual, multifaceted, and incomplete in record. The implication is unresolved loss, while the limitation remains the same. The evidence cannot support definitive conclusions. The enduring fascination with the Library of Alexandria reflects a broader anxiety about lost knowledge. It represents what humanity believes may have vanished forever. The limitation is that this perception is shaped more by absence than by measurable historical loss. Comparisons are often made between Alexandria and modern research institutions. This implies continuity of intellectual ambition. The limitation is that ancient scholarly practices differed fundamentally from modern scientific systems. The idea that the library contained revolutionary discoveries is frequently repeated. This suggests transformative potential. The limitation is that no surviving evidence confirms the existence of such advanced or suppressed knowledge. Many texts lost from antiquity disappeared independently of Alexandria. This implies wider systemic loss. The limitation is isolating the library's role from broader patterns of transmission failure. Knowledge survival in antiquity depended on continuous copying. This fragile chain meant interruption led to disappearance. The limitation is that institutional collapse alone does not explain selective survival. Some works survived because they were useful for administration or religion. This implies functional bias. The limitation is that usefulness does not equate to intellectual value. The Library of Alexandria challenges the assumption that progress is cumulative. Knowledge can regress. The limitation is recognizing regression without exaggerating its scope. The loss highlights dependence on material media. Papyrus decay imposed natural limits. The limitation is environmental inevitability. Alexandria's symbolic status grew as physical evidence diminished. This suggests myth formation. The limitation is conflation of symbol and institution. Historical uncertainty surrounding the library illustrates how gaps become narratives. This affects public understanding. The limitation is narrative replacement of evidence. The library's destruction is often invoked as a warning about intolerance. This implies moral lesson. The limitation is attributing intent to complex historical processes. Scholarly caution emphasizes that no single event erased ancient knowledge. This reframes the story. The limitation is loss of dramatic clarity. The absence of definitive answers sustains debate. This keeps the library relevant. The limitation is unresolved inquiry. Alexandria represents both achievement and vulnerability. This duality defines its legacy. The limitation is interpretive breadth. The library's memory persists despite lack of remains. This implies cultural endurance. The limitation is separation from factual certainty. Historical reconstruction depends on probability rather than certainty. Alexandria exemplifies this method. The limitation is acceptance of ambiguity. Each generation reinterprets the library according to contemporary concerns. This shapes discourse. The limitation is shifting frameworks. The Library of Alexandria cannot be fully recovered in fact or meaning. This defines its mystery. The limitation is irreversible loss. What was lost may never be known, only inferred. This constrains speculation. The limitation is epistemic boundary. The library stands as a reminder that preservation is as important as creation. This implication is enduring. The limitation is hindsight. Without physical remains, debate relies on interpretation of texts. This sustains uncertainty. The limitation is textual fragility. Alexandria's story reveals how easily knowledge can disappear. This influences modern archival thinking. The limitation is extrapolation. The mystery persists not because of hidden evidence, but because evidence is gone. This absence defines the case. The limitation is finality. The Library of Alexandria occupies a space between history and memory. This complicates classification. The limitation is categorical ambiguity. Scholars agree on the library's importance, but not its fate. This consensus divergence defines discussion. The limitation is evidentiary insufficiency. The case illustrates the limits of historical reconstruction. Not all losses are recoverable. The limitation is methodological. Alexandria remains a reference point for debates about cultural loss. This sustains relevance. The limitation is symbolic inflation. The lack of closure ensures continued interest. This keeps inquiry alive. The limitation is perpetual uncertainty. The Library of Alexandria endures as an unresolved chapter in human history. Its significance lies in what cannot be confirmed. The limitation is permanent absence. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.